Thanks, Chris. My my first question is actually building basically exactly, pardon me, on where the chairman just finished. And I really do think that constructive engagement in these committees is better than people trolling for sound bites. So I'm not trying to get you all to fight, but the truth of the matter is this hearing would work a lot better if we were in the same room, so we didn't have to try to bring you all into dialogue. But the last three answers from the social media companies and Mr. Harris's answers are just ultimately not reconcilable, I don't think. And so I want to go back to I'll start with Ms. Bickert as well. But saying that you aspire to healthy engagement as opposed to just more quantity, I agree with Mr. Harris's line that you definitely aspire to skim the most destructive habits and practices off the top of digital addiction. But the business model is addiction, right? I mean, money is directly correlated to the amount of time that people spend on the site. So I guess what would be useful for me is to hear each of the three of you say what you think is wrong with Mr. Harris's argument. Because right now I think we're talking past each other, and I know that there is bad content and there's disinformation content that you all, well-intentioned, as your companies surely are, want to curtail. But his argument is really more broadly about the business model, and the business model is addiction, isn't it? Ms. Bickert, can we start with you? What is Mr. Harris missing?
Senator, thanks for the question. I'll say two things that I hope will be helpful. One is, for us, the focus is always on the long term, and I'll give one concrete example of that. In January of 2018, we put out a post announcing that we were going to be prioritizing content from family and friends over, say, news content. It was called Meaningful Social Interactions. We suspected that it would lead to less time spent on the service, and it did. It led to people spending tens of millions of fewer hours on Facebook every day. But that was something that we did because we thought that longer term, it was more important for people to see that sort of content because they would find it meaningful and they would want to continue to use the site. So it's a long-term picture. And the other thing I would say is the teams that I work with, who include the engineers who are focused on safety issues, removing content, say bullying content or hate speech, and the engineers who are focused on the way that we reduce, for instance, misinformation that's been labeled on the site. A key statistic for those engineers is prevalence, violating content. That's their goal. And we put out public reports on their prevalence. And so, that's an example of how we are focused on the long term and making sure that we are stopping abuse and maintaining a healthy environment.
I want to be clear that I'm not targeting the three of you because my opening statement is very sincere. I think that there is a danger in politics, in governance, where if you agree that there's a problem, then there must be a definitive regulatory solution that can come real fast and easy. And on the other hand, if you're not persuaded there's a regulatory fix right away, then you have to deny there's a problem. I'm sort of a heterodox tweener on this, in that I don't have clarity about what the regulatory fixes would be, but I think society-wide we should admit that there is a problem in the last 12, 14 years as we've consumed more and more digital stuff that seems to be correlated with some benefits, but also some very real costs. And I don't think it's just your companies. I mean, there have been reports out of the New York Times about their own internal deliberations about how they'd like to have more of Americans engaging healthy content. And they're just printing money right now over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. But engagement is much higher when they're angry. And so when the content is angry, it leads to more engagement. And I don't think any of you are really going to dispute that. But I'd like to stay where the question was 2 minutes ago, which is I'd love it if Ms. Culbertson, will you tell me what you think is wrong with Mr. Harris's argument?
We're really focused on serving the public conversation, and that includes having controls in place so people can also control their experience. But I think as we're talking about algorithms today, Twitter really does one thing. We do tweets. We have a home timeline. And as we're talking about algorithms, we have a ranking algorithm that's designed to show you what might be most relevant to you. That also, if we're talking about screen time or how much time you spend on a service, I think that's really relevant because I know as a user of Twitter myself, I rely on that so I can kind of see what happened in the day, what people are talking about, and then I kind of log off, move on with my day. So I think it's important to look at this in a nuanced view and recognize that algorithms can also be helpful in terms of cutting down on screen time or providing a more valuable experience for people.
Sure, but the reality is the loop between the products that are being produced and the way as we as narcissistic sinners consume it is, maybe I'll ask it as a direct question, is it or is it not true that when somebody tweets something that's really anger-invoking and outrageous and it goes viral, but then 2 hours later they realize they were wrong and they correct it, isn't the correction usually like 3% of the traffic of the original outrageous but false thing? I mean, so it seems to me that what we know is that people are pretty good at short-term rage, and the product capitalizes on that, doesn't it?
Well, I think when looking at Twitter, it's important to remember that it's an open, public conversation. And so everything that happens is in the open in the public. And typically, you'll see these debates play out. And, I'm a firm believer that connection and connectivity is key to solving problems. And that's what our service does. Of course, people have robust and spirited debates. But I think you have to look at the greater picture there.
We are basically at time, so I won't get the chairman to indulge me much longer. But Ms. Veach, do you have anything to say that you think Mr. Harris is wrong about? It would be useful, but right now we're not getting much direct engagement with that. He's making a big argument, and I think we're hearing responses that are only around the margins. Ms. Veach, do you have any criticism of Mr. Harris's argument?
I think in your opening statement, you called these nettlesome problems. I agree, they are. I would just make 2 quick points. First, misinformation is not in our interest. Our business relies on the trust of our users, but also our advertisers who on our platform advertise on single pieces of content. We want to build these relationships for the long term. That's why we bake user choice, user control right into the product with things like timers and the opportunity to turn autoplay off, take a break reminders, of which we've sent over 1 billion. Again, those exist so we can build this relationship with our users for the long term.
Thank you. I do think a lot of those user preference tools to manage our level of engagement bridging over to addiction are really important innovations. So I applaud those tools. Thank you, Chairman Coons. And again, thank you to all 5 of you for being here. I do want to put another question to Mr. Harris, but before I start that second round of questioning, I would like to just briefly address colleagues on both sides of the aisle, because both Republican and Democratic colleagues today have said a number of things that presumed more precision about the problem than we've actually identified here, and then sort of picked up the most ready tool, usually the 230 discussion. And I think I'm a lot more skeptical than maybe most on this committee to push to a regulatory solution at this stage. And I think in particular, some of the conversations about Section 230 have been well off point to the actual topic at hand today. And I think much of the zeal to regulate is driven by short-term partisan agendas. And I think it would be more useful for us to stick closer to the topic that the chairman identified from this hearing. I also think it's important for members of Congress to constantly remind ourselves that we're bound by First Amendment constraints in our job. And a number of the lines of questioning, again, on both the right and left sides of this panel today, talked as if the First Amendment is sort of, this marginal topic that we don't have to be obsessively concerned about. And yet we need to draw a distinction between the First Amendment and the true public square as regulated by the powers of the government, and the fact that the companies we're talking about, Amy Klobuchar has raised some important topics about scale and antitrust issues, but the companies we're talking about are private companies. And so I just think there are a number of First Amendment public-private distinctions that we should be attending to a little more closely than maybe we did today. But Mr. Harris, can you tell us what discussions you've seen or been a part of, either inside the extant companies or at the VCPE environment, potential different business models besides an ad revenue centric business model? Can you just give us a kind of blue sky on that question?
Yeah, fantastic question. Thank you, Senator. I mean, obviously there are subscription models. There is public interest models, more like Wikipedia. But I want to make an additional distinction, which is not just the funding model, but it's the design model. The engagement and advertising model works because of the design that says user-generated content. We're all the unpaid journalists. Previously, you had to pay a journalist at a Fox News and New York Times $100,000 a year to write content to get people to look at it, and that's the cost of attention production. But what if you could harvest each of us as useful idiots to take our 5 minutes of moral outrage and then use that to generate attention production for free? So we're the unpaid labor, for the attention economy, that is sort of duped into sharing information with each other, which reduce the costs for all these technology companies. And then on the editorial side, instead of paying an editor at a New York Times, at a Fox News, at a whatever, $100,000 a year, $200,000 a year, we actually have algorithms, which we also don't have to pay, to randomly sort that to people. This happens in a values blind process, which means that in general, you get harm showing up in all of the blind spots. Suddenly, Joan wakes up and says, hey, there's this problem, there's this problem, this problem. The companies will respond and say, okay, fine, we'll take the whack-a-mole stick and we'll deal with those three problems. But in general, values blindness destroys our democracy faster than people like Renee and Joan and so many of our friends in this community are essentially raising the alarms about it. And that's fundamentally the kind of core design model, more so than the funding model. We could have public interest technology that's funded for public interest. We could tax these companies to put into a regenerative fund. There's a whole bunch of models we could do. One in energy, just like energy companies have this perverse incentive where they make more money the more energy you use. So theoretically, leave the lights on, leave the faucets on, we make more money. But they don't do that because instead they have a model that's regulated so that after a certain amount, they double charge you, triple charge you to disincentivize your energy use. But then that, instead of going into the private business model of the companies, the balance sheets, it gets put into a regenerative fund to increase the transition to solar. Imagine that technology companies, which today profit from an infinite amount of engagement, only made money from a small portion of that, let's say some small amount of time. And the rest basically was taxed to put into a regenerative public interest fund. And this funded things like the Fourth Estate, fact checkers, researchers, public interest technologists, things like that. Because what we really need to do is, as we said, organize a comprehensive shift to more humane technology so a digital open society can compete digital closed societies.
Very helpful. There's if we had more time, I was going to ask some questions about whether or not you think there, given your role as an ethicist, whether or not there are debates inside the company about what the optimal user time on a site is every given day, and is there a distinction between a fully consenting, assenting 49-year-old like myself, and how those platforms think about it for a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old as well. But I know that Chris and I both need to go and vote, so I will just echo the thanks to all five of you for the fulsome discussion today, and to be continued.